All right. Hey guys, it's Khalil,
Hey, it's Chad.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. All right, so starting our what should be our final episode of this ethno-nationalism series, and thanks for everybody who's stuck with us for this long series. And we this is something that we were hoping to expand upon in our last major series, with the far left equals the far right, and what fascism is, and the definitions of that, and how it's morphed into the modern day into ethno-nationalism and other forms of nationalism. Um, but today we're going to talk about um, more rather less obvious examples of ethno-nationalism, and really more or less asking the question, because it really is a question of whether or not they can be considered ethno-nationalists. And the first one, we have to start with Viktor Orban of Hungary. Um, this guy is very much supported on the American right. He's about to speak at the American CPAC convention, um, and he has and he's actually the leader of a nation that is part of NATO, an American ally. And so again, you have another possible human rights abuser, or far right dictator that is an American ally that we are choosing to ignore for whatever reasons. He is a playbook right-wing populist, an Islamophobe, and advocates for a homogenous Hungarian state. So, Chad, do you have anything else to say?
Yeah, and so with that, we'll kind of go into just describing him more. So one of the things, as we mentioned at the end, that's he's sometimes advocated for a homogenous Hungarian state. And just looking at the blanket definition, that's a great indicator that someone is an ethno-nationalist. And we'll get into the example of that later. But to start out, some of the moves that Orban has done himself is that after he returned to power in 2010, he pushed for a law that gave foreigners who were of Hungarian ancestry or who had quote unquote knowledge of the Hungarian language and other like the Hungarian culture, pushed for a law and ended up getting it passed that would give out passports to these citizens who were in different countries but had Hungarian um, ancestry. And so they would get these passports and would therefore be able to vote in the Hungarian election. And this was actually the case um, in, I believe, the election of 2015 or 2014, where this gave him an advantage of who was voting for him. And so here you have an example of a leader who was using the idea of his ethnicity being spread out in different countries as a way to gain more power. While it's not in the same way as leaders as Putin who have used that as an excuse to invade other nations. In this case, it's more of a power grab or just another source that he could gain to get votes or more seats in the parliament. But that's one of the ways that Orban has been kind of advocating for this, um, at least the greater idea of Hungarian ancestry and I wouldn't say supremacy, but more importance.
Right. And this has caused a lot of problems in the EU because the Hungary is part of the EU as of now, as well as Poland. And Orban's policies, whether it be anti-LGBT or giving voting rights to people who aren't Hungarian but may share some sort of Hungarian blood, because for whatever reason, ethnicity is considered something that's carried by blood nowadays, which can be pulled back over to Hitler and Mussolini. But yeah, the EU is founded largely upon like European democracies sticking together. And the point that we're going to continue to make um, is that like Hungary has had a history of ethno-nationalism and of anti-democratic um, um, acts. And with Viktor Orban, that is being brought back into the light. So Hungary has a history of ethno-nationalism if you look back to World War II as one of Nazi Germany's most anti-Semitic, Slavophobic, and pro-Nazi allies in Europe, along with Romania and Austria and Italy. Hungary was right up there, contributing men to the fight in the invasion of the Soviet Union, as well as um, inviting certain anti-Semitic policies for which they would contribute in their own way to the Holocaust. So, in the last months of the war, as the Soviet Red Army advanced closer to Germany, they were held up around the Hungarian capital of Budapest, where fighting around the city limits to its eventual siege lasted about 4 months, one of the longest battles in Central Europe during World War II, as much of the longer battles like the siege of Leningrad or the battle around Moscow or or even Stalingrad. Those were mainly within the Soviet Union, and those were the battles and the sieges that lasted incredibly long. But on the actual continent of Europe, you know, um, you know, not many cities were able to hold out for so long, whether it be because of a lack of population of the defenders, or because of the military supremacy of Hitler's armies at the beginning of the war, and then later the Allied military supremacy at the end of the war. So anyway, this delaying action was more than just simply defending one's nation from invaders, because for months it delayed the liberation of several concentration/slash death camps in Central Europe under Nazi control. And this didn't this also had the effect of a Hungarian fascist organization that was based within the city of Budapest, contributing to the defense of the city, killing 15,000 Jewish people openly in the streets in broad daylight, often, with a viciousness that was, quoting Christian Ungvari in his book Battle for Budapest, was unparalleled anywhere else in Europe under Nazi rule. So, while Orban actually does not represent the most far-right ethno-nationalist wing of the Hungarian parliament, as Chad's going to explain, in the recent re-election campaign this year, in a speech made by him on the racial purity of Hungary, which again we'll continue to explain, he turned heads as his politics may be moving even further back to the darkest days of Hungary's history.
Yeah, and to follow along with that point, in a speech that he made in December of 2021, Orban stated in regards to another nation of the European Union, he said that the Hungary need to demobilize a lot of um, energy to overcome the enlargement fatigue that has taken hold of the European Union. And so, in that statement, that enlargement fatigue is in reference to immigrants. Um, Europe, since the various different wars going on in the Middle East, such as the Syrian civil war, has received millions upon millions of immigrants fleeing this conflict and looking for asylum or a new place to stay. And throughout Europe, we've had a lot of leaders use that as a reason to, fan populist sentiments, fan anti-immigrant sentiments throughout their countries. Big example of that is Brexit. Um, but Hungary as well has done this. And in reference to, let's see, in reference to, where is the state? And to another nation, he said that I'm doing my best to convince Europe's great leaders that the Balkans may be further away from them from Hungary, but how we manage the security of a state in which 2 million Muslims live is a key issue for their security too. And so here, in reference to the Balkan states, which we've also talked about in regards to another leader of the time, uh, Slobodan Milosevic and his ethno-nationalist reign, he referenced um, Orban is referencing the Balkans and their taking in of Muslim immigrants. And so here again, you have him, he's bringing up immigration again as a security threat. And usually, when authoritarian leaders bring up a group as security threats, that's an excuse for persecution, marginalization, And in other countries, for the example of China, it can even be the forced assimilation of these groups into their greater national culture. And so with Orban, he takes the issue again of immigration and weaponizes it as a reason that Hungary should become more homogenous, should become more not just proud of its culture, but more supporting of it at the expense of these new groups, of these new refugees and immigrants that are coming in. So with that, I have another example of um, the Hungarian government kind of pursuing this issue. And so in 2015, I believe, Orban, his government had a national consultation on immigration, which was basically a questionnaire sent out to Hungarian citizens asking what their view on immigration was. And at its core, this initiative was one that was aimed against at immigration. It sought to gain the responses and the votes of the Hungarian people, hoping that it would come out as anti-immigration, so that could be used by the government. But along with this survey being sent out, it was accompanied by a lot of posters and slogans, some of which included, if you come to Hungary, you can't take jobs from Hungarians. If you come to Hungary, you have to respect our culture. And if you come to Hungary, you have to respect our laws. And so here you have an example of um, a greater anti-immigrant sentiment using the language of civic nationalism. And this is a system that we talked about in great length in our second episode of the series. And we highlighted that with civic nationalism, it uses the rhetoric of immigration being welcome if they were to assimilate into the greater culture. Now, this idea itself is very marginalistic, as um, it seeks to get these new immigrants, to get these new people coming into the country to lose their home cultures in order to gain basically the respect um, or the benefits of the country itself. Because if an immigrant was to come in with their own home culture, the nation or the people in government could see that as split loyalty or someone who is working against the country. And so civic nationalists often argue for assimilation of immigrants who come to the country. But with Orban, again, he uses that rhetoric, but deeper down, there is a kind of disdain for immigrants coming into the country, as there is in a lot of European countries. And we see that emblemized in some of his speeches and the example as I just shown.
Right. Um, it's also important to know that as we've already mentioned, Orban, he really does consider Hungary to be a pure state. In fact, on immigration, he is quoted as once saying, "We consider it a value that Hungary is a homogenous country," and then saying, "quote, Hungary has never been multicultural." So this is interesting, because it looks to his own views of his country and it being homogenous and it being never being multicultural, which automatically assumes that the introduction or the immigration of anybody that does not identify with being ethnically Hungarian, that they will be disrupting that homogeneity or the ethnic purity of that nation, really railing against multiculturalism, um, when by railing against multiculturalism, as Chad is very eager to mention, he's actually supporting a unicultural um, push within his own country to purify his own nation. At the very simplest, that's really what he's advocating for. But um, it's it's also, there is apparently a 1,000-year-old quote from King Istvan, the founding father of Hungary and its first king, that, quote, a monocultural and monolingual kingdom is weak and fragile, which goes very much against Orban's idea that Hungary, of course, he as a nationalist, he's going to say that Hungary is strong. And then he says that he considers it a value that Hungary is a homogenous country. And he goes and almost congratulating himself, for bringing Hungary to be a nation that has never been multicultural, when the founding father of Hungary is disagreeing with him wholeheartedly and saying that such a nation, such a kingdom, in this case, it's a nation, not a kingdom, but that is monocultural, monolingual, and monoethnic is weak, so you can really see that according to the history of his own nation and a founding figure of his nation that he would probably regard, in a very um, supporting, very favorable fashion in the history books that are taught to children, is actually going right against his own policy.
Oh yeah, I'm sure King Istvan would probably spit on Orban's view that Hungary values a homogenous country because that just makes no sense. We talked about ethno-states earlier in the series and the kind of failure that an ethno-state would have. The whole idea of them does not make sense in a modern world. Just given just how easy it is for people to move around and just how many quote minorities are in every single country. It doesn't make sense it's not realistic, and it's also of course a violation of human rights and all that for an ethno state to even exist. So advocating for a homogenous country just it doesn't make any sense. But
And
anyways,
also,
yeah.
yeah, like to force an ethno state, like what Orban is seemingly seeking to do or hoping to do, with his rhetoric of like praising the nation so much for being homogenous, for being monocultural, monolingual, and whatever, and being so ethnically pure, you know, I mean, you can take from that that he's trying to force an ethno state, which, as we've mentioned again in the past in one of our past episodes in this series, is impossible. It goes against human nature, and it's bound to fail. So, in a CNN source on Viktor Orban and his racist speech that he made very recently, I believe it was actually only a few days ago, um, CNN is reporting on the response to his speech by those closest to him. Quote, Zusa Hegedus, um, who served as an advisor to Orban for 2 decades, quit Tuesday over what she called Orban's illiberal turn, describing his comments in Romania on Saturday as a pure Nazi text worthy of Nazi propagandist Goebbels, according to a resignation letter published by Hungarian outlet HVG. He was also denounced by the international Auschwitz community after comments in the same speech that were interpreted as a joke about the use of gas chambers against Jewish people in Nazi Germany. Orban told a crowd that Europeans do not want to mix with people outside the continent. Quote from him: "This is why we have always fought. We are willing to mix. We are willing to mix with one another, but we do not want to become peoples of mixed race." End quote. Orban said. Continuing the quote from CNN, he warned that Islamic civilization is constantly moving towards Europe, and that in the future, those whom we do not want to let in will have to be stopped at Hungary's western borders, regardless of the country's membership of the Schengen area of open borders across 26 European countries.
Yeah. So once again, that's kind of the nail in the coffin for him. He advocates that again, Hungary should be that it values it being a majority homogenous state. And then here you have a couple of days ago just going out there and saying it that he does not want Hungary to become a state of mixed race people. He doesn't want mixing with quote, well, not quote, but what's emphasized there is the Islamic civilization, the refugees. Again, multiculturalism, as a lot of European nationalists seem to phrase it, I see as kind of like a dog whistle towards um, again, going towards ethno-nationalism and going towards more homogenous states, because the idea of multiculturalism is people from other countries moving in, people of different races, of different ethnicities, and for Europe, that's a lot of that is immigrants. Um, and again, with Europe, they always seem to have an issue with immigrants and seeing them as a threat to their what have usually been um, homogenous or just largely same ethnicity countries. And so when you have these leaders railing against multiculturalism or immigration, what you really see is these leaders advocating for the um, their mainly homogenous nations or their ideally homogenous nations staying the same and not letting in these immigrants who would ruin that idea, continue.
Right. Um, and yeah, exactly. I mean, I would almost jump straight to the question of whether or not Orban is an ethno-nationalist and then answer it saying, honestly, probably, because
Yeah,
it's not just against the religion of Islam, it's against the race of people that
the
come from
Islamic
Islamic
civilization.
civilization. So, his rhetoric of Hungary being an ethnically homogenous state, it being monocultural, monolingual, and it being a great value that it is, and then going to these international like headlined events, saying that he's simply trying to defend Europe from becoming peoples of mixed race. I would actually jump to say that he is an ethno-nationalist. It's just
Yeah,
that it might be that because of the relatively limited number of people that um, are not ethnically Hungarian within Hungary, and therefore like adding to Orban's rhetoric that Hungary is a rather ethnically homogenous state, that there is not much of a minority within the country other than maybe Jewish people to to persecute. If there
yeah,
was a larger minority of like um, smaller ethnic groups, then we'd probably see a lot more damning legislation against those peoples from him and his party. I would just say though that the way how he sees himself as like the savior of Europe and the cult of personality that's surrounding him within Hungary is rather characteristic of an ethno-nationalist dictator.
yeah. I would definitely agree in saying that Orban is an ethno-nationalist. But as you said, his actions so far, he hasn't taken much action um, to kind of further these ethno-nationalist views as far as some other ones have, such as Erdogan or Putin or Xi Jinping, or going even back to, Hitler and Mussolini. So far, he just hasn't done too much with it. But again, that's a warning. That means there's time to stop it before the persecution comes, which may happen. So yeah, I would definitely agree that Orban is an ethno-nationalist. Um, and
Right.
with that, yeah, and with that, we'd like to move on to our next example of someone who might be an ethno-nationalist, but we could bring it up for our conversation, is Andrzej Duda of Poland. And so with him, one of the kind of core tenet of what he does is more of a religious nationalism and just more of the standard conservative playbook and advocating, for these in America, we call them kind of culture wars of going against, the LGBT ideology, as he would later call it, and going against different minority groups and somewhat immigration. But for him, it is not as um, it is not as like well stated or not as open as people like Orban is, but he still has the emphasis there, and it's kind of more on the religious aspect. And Khalil, if you
Right.
want, you could kind of give the background on Poland, but just keep in mind we don't have too much time. We have a while.
Of course. Yeah. Duda, he relies much more on using religion to persecute parts of Poland that he may deem um, as a demographic threat to the country, and again, it's not too uncontroversial to say that he isn't going as far as like people like Xi or Putin or Erdogan or even Orban, but he's utilizing, religious nationalism within the country based off of its history, which I'm about to explain, to go through these rather anti-democratic policies. And that's why similar to Orban, he's getting a lot of attacks from the EU and even threats of expulsion. So, real quick, Poland's modern history has been marred by struggles of independence against aggressive larger empires. In the late 1700s, the German Prussian kingdom, which would later turn into the German Empire in the decades leading up to World War One, and the Habsburg Austrian Empire and the Russian Empire carved up the powerful centuries-old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the region around modern-day Poland and Baltic nations in a series of partitions, wiping the nation off the map. In its existence, it has fought off invasions in the Commonwealth's existence from the 1200s-ish to the 1700s. It has fought off invasions by Teutonic Crusader knights that wanted to forcefully convert them to Christianity, Mongols, and Ottoman Turks that wanted to wipe away that Christian identity, intending to spread the Islamic faith into Europe. Um, and of course, between the Teutonic Knights and the Ottoman Turks, they had converted to Christianity just to get rid of that confusion, but whatever. For over a century, Poland remained choked by these three great power empires of Prussia, Austria, and Russia until the conditions upon which World War One ended called for its independence, which was promptly ignored 20 years later in a secret pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which I believe we already mentioned previous, and which carved up Poland between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The chaos of World War II and lines shifting back and forth, Poland was a bit of a um, of a battleground during this time. But it ended with Soviet domination over the country for the next 50 years until finally Poland had independence for the first time in over 2 centuries. Today, Poles have a very strong sense of national identity, especially its politicians, and reject anything that can be perceived as a threat to its independence, whether it be secularism, Islam, globalism, immigration, or critiques of its domestic policy from abroad. Its leader, Andrezj Duda, has best fostered these emotions in the public by embracing religion as a weapon against political dissent in domestic/foreign policy and rejecting Muslim immigration from the Middle East as a second series of invasions from the Neo-Ottoman hordes.
Yeah, very interesting. But yeah, with Poland, it's more of going back to that religious root and using that as a basis for how they make their decisions. And as we demonstrated, they've been through a lot. So it's not too surprising to see that they have some hot takes. But as we said, Andrzej Duda, he takes a very more it's weird to say mainstream now, but a more mainstream approach towards like kind of the minority groups. One of them has been the LGBTQ community. Recently, he came under fire during the recent election because in a speech he called the LGBTQ identities as an ideology, which was more destructive than communism. And then, of course, in response to that, he passed a law calling for a family charter, um, which had pledges to prevent gay couples from marrying or adopting children and to ban the teaching of LGBTQ issues in school. And of course, interesting to note, they never taught him in schools, but that hasn't stopped him from banning it, and that's very reminiscent in the United States. But anyways, he favors um, making the Poland's anti-abortion laws more strict, and they already have some of the most restrictive abortion laws in Europe, in which they have, I believe it's even banned. Um, it is banned in the case of different like fetal impairments. And they have, so as I said, they have a very harsh anti-abortion law in Poland. But his ideology is very weird to say, but mainline conservative, but mainly using the weaponization of religion to do so.
Right. And um, Duda, he has continued in his anti-democratic policies under the guise of religion by saying once, um, oh, actually, not necessarily by him personally, but by a statement of the chairman of the Law and Justice Policy party in Poland, Duda's ruling party, saying, quote, every good Pole should know what the role of the church is, because beyond the church, there is only nihilism, end quote. So there's a lot to pick apart right there, and we don't have a whole lot of time, but basically, like the secular aspects of Poland that it shows on paper are not really being used in practice because this is the ruling party here, and they're trying to basically like utilize mass politics in the same way Mussolini and Hitler and other dictators since then had tried to do, by trying to find a sort of a common unity amongst them, because Poland is a majority Christian state, and so they're trying to use the church to take over everything, and they use the alternative as being like the worst possible thing, which is nihilism, the end of society, and so, they basically are using that religion to get people to stick to them, and then once they have them stick, then they can do whatever they want.
Yeah. Um, as we come, oh, we have about 5 minutes. Don't be too worried about the time. But yeah, before we kind of move on and get to our conclusion, I wanted to touch on another point about Duda's ideology, is that Poland is not hugely anti-immigrant, compared to Orban. Um, and a big example of that is Ukraine. Um, Poland, a report came out kind of recently saying that Poland will spend up to 25 billion zloty, or their equivalent of almost 5.3 billion US dollars, which is actually about 1% of the country's GDP, in order to help the almost more than 3 million Ukrainian refugees that they've taken in since the war started. And so for Ukrainian refugees, they've been pretty welcoming. There have been in their countries, there is some anti-Ukrainian sentiment, but just within kind of smaller opposition parties. But for the most part, Poland has been pretty accepting of Polish immigrants, I mean, of Ukrainian immigrants. However, for immigrants of other countries, it's been a little more, it's been a little different. And that same party leader who we mentioned in the last quote was quoted as saying that migrants from Europe have already brought diseases like cholera and dysentery to Europe, as well as all sorts of parasites and protozoa. And so he kind of paints immigrants as bringing diseases and just being, of course, bad in that sort. So to kind of end out our point on Andrzej Duda, I would conclude that he's not exactly an ethno-nationalist. He may be getting towards one, but it's more so of a religious nationalism or just right-wing populism that you see growing in Europe. So yeah, you go.
We have very limited time in this episode to go to the conclusion that we wanted to get to, which will surprise many of you. So I don't know. I mean, I might actually support the idea of releasing 3 episodes today. Huh.
Potentially, but the idea that we were kind of, well, through this whole series we wanted to illuminate various world leaders who are ethno-nationalists or are leaning towards it, because we want to give you all a greater warning of those people. And at the end of this, one of the points that we wanted to bring up is that we have one who might not be a little too far from home, and that is Donald Trump. Big surprise. Um, and to go through kind of quickly some of his ideas on immigration, such as building the border wall, such as his quote calling Mexican immigrants as rapists, murderers, who need to be sent out. And then, of course, the 2017 Muslim ban, banning countries from a lot of the Muslim world in northern Africa. He's had a lot of actions that have brought him close to ethno-nationalism through anti-immigrant kind of rhetoric throughout his rule. Um, you pick off of that one, but
Yeah, I mean, we got to get close to finishing up, but basically by using Trump as the example, and we might have another episode for this to really cap it off, but maybe we won't. Is that Trump? He's dangerous to talk about in this sense, or at least it's hard to talk about him in this sense because Americans don't want to feel that they had let one in so close to home. If Europe was their backyard, was our backyard as Americans, then Trump is in the basement. So I mean, like many people, like it's scary to think about him in that way, to put him in the same sense as other dictators around the world. But we might make the case at some later point, and that later point may be the next episode you watch, which may be released today, that um, Trump
yeah, he
may
may
be that
be.
internationalist that is
We
close
may
to
have
home.
one on our own doorstep. We're getting pretty close to time, so I hope you've enjoyed this series. Thank you all for watching. We are the Marshals of Truth, and we will probably see you in the next episode.